what does it actually mean to be mad? It feels like a simple question. We sort of think we have a handle on it.
Right, we use the word all the time.
Exactly. But if you really stop and dig into it, you find that our modern idea of madness, what it is, who gets labeled that way, how we deal with it, it's not fixed. Not at all.
It's definitely not timeless or universal. It's changed so much over the centuries.
And those changes tell us a lot, not just about medicine, actually, but about society, about power, even philosophy, really, about what we think it means to be human.
And that's precisely what we're going to unpack today. We're doing a deep dive into a really influential and, frankly, quite challenging book from the 20th century, Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason.
Okay, so not just a history lesson then.
No, not at all. It's this groundbreaking look at how society has understood and, more importantly, dealt with what it considers deviant thinking or behavior. Foucault takes us on this incredible journey, starting way back with ideas like folly and unreason, moving through this so-called Age of Reason, and then landing right at the very beginnings of our modern medical view of mental illness.
So our mission here, for you listening, is to kind of give you a shortcut into Foucault's big ideas. We want to peel back those historical layers that have shaped how we see sanity, how we see madness.
And you'll find, I think, that these concepts, they're less about some kind of objective, unchanging scientific truth.
Right.
And much more about, well, power structures in society, how knowledge itself changes over time, and how all of that subtly influences how we deal with information, how we deal with difference, even in our everyday lives today.
And this fits into Foucault's bigger project, doesn't it? His whole critical history of thought. He wasn't just trying to list historical facts.
No, not at all. He was asking how we came to know things. What were the conditions that made certain kinds of knowledge possible or even legitimate? And, crucially, who got to decide what counted as real knowledge and what didn't? He really challenges that whole idea of neutral objective knowledge.
Yeah, that's fundamental to his work.
Absolutely. And Madness and Civilization is such a perfect example because it zooms in on these, well, often uncomfortable areas where the person doing this, knowing the subject, also becomes the object of that knowledge.
Okay, can you unpack that a bit? How does that apply to madness?
Think about it. How did the figure of the madman go from being maybe a public spectacle, someone people laughed at or philosophized about, to becoming an object for doctors to study, to classify, to treat, to intervene upon? That's the transformation Foucault is tracing.
So he's not drawing a nice, neat line of progress like, we used to be ignorant, now we're enlightened.
Definitely not. He uses what he calls an archaeological approach, like digging down through layers of history, looking for the breaks, the shifts, the discontinuity and disruption, as he puts it. Those moments where thinking fundamentally changed, often quite suddenly, almost violently.
So history isn't a smooth climb. It's full of these ruptures, these earthquakes that completely redefine how we understand something like madness.
Exactly. And he keeps coming back to these core questions. In any given era, what makes someone a legitimate source of knowledge? And what makes something or someone an appropriate object for study? Applying this to madness reveals that our modern diagnoses, our treatments, our whole system, it wasn't inevitable.
It wasn't destined to be this way.
No, it's the result of specific historical forces, accidents almost, and crucially, power dynamics.
Which brings us to one of his most, startling ideas, the idea about truth itself.
Yes, this one really makes you think. He suggests that truth might be seen as, and I'm quoting here, the sort of error that cannot be refuted because it was hardened into an unalterable form in the long baking process of history.
Wow. Okay, let's pause on that. Truth as a hardened error.
Yeah. It suggests that some of our most deeply held beliefs, things we take completely for granted as true or normal about society or human nature, might just be historical mistakes or viewpoints from a specific power position that have become so baked in, so normalized over time, that we can't even see them as errors anymore.
That's huge. It really asks you to question the foundations of, everything we think we know.
It's a radical rethinking, definitely.
Okay, so to unpack that, let's travel way back. Before the asylums, before madness was locked away, let's talk about medieval Europe. Because Foucault starts somewhere maybe unexpected with leprosy.
That's right. He paints this picture of medieval Europe just dotted with these huge isolated places called leprosariums. He calls them, quite starkly, cities of the damned.
And the scale was enormous, wasn't it?
Just incredible. There's a chronicler, Mathieu Paris, who mentioned something like 19,000 leprosariums across all of Christendom. And in France alone, around the year 1226, there were apparently over 2,000 registered ones.
2,000 in France alone.
Yeah. Think about these big complexes near major cities like Paris Saint-Germain, Saint-Lazare, even Charenton, which became famous later for other reasons. These weren't small huts. They were large, often self-sufficient communities housing thousands of people. Leprosy was this constant, visible presence, a source of both profound fear and maybe the strange kind of fascination.
But then something strange happens. These places start to empty out.
Exactly, and it's quite mysterious. Somewhere between the 15th and 16th centuries, leprosy just declines significantly. It wasn't like they found a cure overnight. It just seemed to recede across Europe.
So these massive institutions built to house lepers become vacant.
Largely, yes. By the early 17th century, many were almost empty. Saint-Germain, one of the big ones near Paris, got turned into a kind of reformatory for young offenders. Saint-Lazare, another huge one, apparently only had one leper left by the time St. Vincent de Paul was active there. Even the massive leprosarium in Nancy had just 4 inmates early in the 17th century. And Toulouse went from 7 down to 3. People at the time saw it almost as a miracle, a divine deliverance.
Okay, but this leaves behind these huge buildings, these architectural shells, and also this kind of social anxiety, right? The space that leprosy occupied in the public mind. What fills that void?
This is where Foucault makes a key move. He argues that this vacant space, both physical and social, gets re-inhabited, in a way, by folly. But it's a very different kind of madness than we might picture.
Right, not like the scary, monstrous demons you see in paintings by someone like Hieronymus Bosch.
Exactly. That was more about an obscure cosmic manifestation, an external evil. The Renaissance idea of madness, especially if you look at someone like the humanist Erasmus, was much more internal.
Internal how?
Erasmus saw it as a subtle rapport that man maintains with himself. He famously wrote, "Only follies exist human forms of madness." It wasn't some alien force invading you. It was, in his view, something present in everyone. No madness but that which is in every man.
So like human weakness, illusions.
Precisely. Dreams, vanities, self-deception. He talks about this concept, fallacious self-attachment or self-love. That's the starting point of folly, he thought. It's when you get so wrapped up in yourself, your own ideas, your own desires, that you start accepting error as truth, lies as reality, violence and ugliness as beauty and justice.
He had some great examples of that, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely vivid ones. Like the man who's uglier than a monkey imagines himself handsome as Nereus. It's not clinical delusion in our sense, but it's that deep self-deception born out of vanity, maybe stubbornness. It's the commentary on the human condition itself.
So folly wasn't a disease to be cured, but more like a mirror reflecting our own absurdities back at us.
Exactly. It was part of the human comedy, maybe darkly funny sometimes, but acknowledged, visible, tolerated, not something you'd necessarily lock away or try to eliminate.
So what's the takeaway here for you listening today? This earlier view allowed madness or folly to be out in the open. It wasn't immediately pathologized or hidden. It was seen, maybe sometimes uncomfortably, as part of being human.
Right. And it makes you think, doesn't it? How do we react to eccentricity or difference today? Do we still see follies as just part of the messy business of being human, something to maybe chuckle at or understand?
Or do we rush to find a label, a diagnosis, a fix for anything that doesn't fit our increasingly narrow idea of what's sane or normal? It signals a really fundamental shift in how society engages with difference.
A huge shift. Which brings us to the next major phase Foucault identifies. The classical age, roughly the 17th century. This is where he says things take a really sharp, almost violent turn.
How so?
He calls it a strange act of force. Those voices of madness, the follies that the Renaissance had sort of allowed out into the open, even integrated into culture. Now, he argues, they are systematically reduced to silence. A shift from visibility to profound, enforced invisibility.
And this wasn't just a minor change.
No, the scale is incredible. Foucault calls it the Great Confinement. He points out that in Paris, within just a few months of these new institutions being set up, something like more than 1 out of every 100 inhabitants found themselves locked up.
1% of Paris. That's immense.
It's a massive number, a deliberate societal move. And crucially, Foucault argues really strongly against the idea that this was primarily about caring for the sick or being benevolent.
Okay, so if it wasn't mainly about kindness or curing people, what was driving it, according to Foucault?
He says it was driven by 2 main things: an imperative of labor and a harsh condemnation of idleness.
Labor and idleness, how did that connect to locking people up?
Well, look at the creation of the Hôpital General in Paris. It was set up by royal edict in 1656, and its stated goal, right there in the edict, was to prevent mendicancy and idleness as the source of all disorders.
Wow, explicitly stated.
Explicitly. And this wasn't a new idea either. It
Huh.
built on a long history of trying to control poverty and unemployment, often brutally. Back in 1532, the Parliament of Paris decided to arrest beggars and force them to work, get this, chained in pairs in the sewers.
Chained in sewers? That's horrifying.
It's a truly grim image. And by the early 1600s, the decrees got even tougher. Beggars could be whipped, branded, have their heads shaved, banished from the city. They even put archers at the gates to stop them coming back.
Why such extreme measures? What was going on economically and socially?
You have to remember the context. Europe had been absolutely devastated by decades of war, like the 30 Years' War. This led to huge economic disruption, mass poverty, wandering populations, begging, unemployment. Idleness was seen as a massive social problem, a threat to order.
So these institutions were a way to contain that problem and make people work.
Precisely. The Hospital General and similar places popping up all over Europe like the Zuchthausen in Germany, the workhouses in England, they were designed to absorb this unemployed population, put the able-bodied poor, beggars, the idle, and yes, lumped in with them the mad, put them all to work.
So the mad were confined not necessarily because they were seen as medically ill in our sense, but because they were unproductive, idle.
That's a huge part of Foucault's argument. They were grouped together with the poor and the idle because they all represented a problem for social order and economic utility. Colbert, the big French finance minister at the time, explicitly saw assistance through work as the answer to cure unemployment and boost manufacturing. His directive was clear. The poor capable of working must work, to avoid idleness, the mother of all evils, and to earn their keep. It was about managing populations and enforcing labor.
That really changes how you think about the origins of these institutions. It wasn't purely about care.
Far from it, Foucault argues. It was deeply tied to economic policy and social control.
And this focus on labor and control also connects to how the prison developed, right? Foucault talks about the prison becoming seen as almost natural. How did that happen?
He argues the prison gained this self-evidence because it seemed to serve two functions at once. First, a juridico-economic one. Imprisonment was like paying a debt to society for a crime.
Okay.
And second, a technico-disciplinary one. It was a technology specifically designed for transforming individuals, for correcting them, making them docile and productive. It wasn't seen as this completely alien thing. It was modeled on existing structures like military barracks, strict schools, workshops, even monasteries.
So because it resembled familiar forms of discipline, it just seemed like the obvious civilized way to punish people.
Exactly. It became the default penalty, the seemingly natural consequence, even for those considered mad who were disruptive or didn't fit the mold.
And what were these early methods of correction like inside these places? You mentioned discipline.
They were often incredibly harsh, focused on breaking the will and imposing obedience. Foucault unearths descriptions of things like a steam machine for caloriferous correction of young boys and girls, basically. A mechanized whipping machine.
Whipping machines, seriously?
Designed for children deemed lazy, greedy, disobedient, rebellious. It sounds utterly horrific. Designed purely to instill docility through pain and fear, and the general regulations in these maisons centrales, these confinement houses, were brutal. Enforced silence, minimal food, constant back-breaking labor. The explicit goal was docility, work habits, making people fit to re-enter the labor force or just keeping them contained and productive within the walls.
It wasn't about rehabilitation in our sense then. It was about molding and controlling.
Very much so.
So for you listening, this whole section really forces a critical look at institutions we might take for granted, institutions supposedly for care or correction. Foucault pushes you to ask, what are their historical roots? Was their primary purpose always individual well-being?
Or was it more about social control, economic utility, managing populations deemed problematic?
And you can think about echoes today. Do we see traces of this condemnation of idleness, this prioritizing of labor and current social policies, welfare programs that demand work, certain models of rehabilitation that focus heavily on conformity and productivity, even the logic behind mass incarceration?
It makes you question the underlying assumptions, doesn't it? What values are truly driving these systems, even now?
Definitely. Okay, let's shift gears slightly and move into what Foucault terms the science of madness as it developed in this classical age. He talks about the role of passion. How was that understood differently back then?
It's quite different from our simple cause and effect view. In the classical understanding, passion wasn't just an emotion causing a reaction. It was seen as this complex, ongoing, perpetual metaphorical relation between the soul and the body. And madness, crucially, was seen as arising from a break in that relationship, a suspension of passion, a breach of causality.
A breach of causality, what does that mean?
It means you'd see these violent movements of nerves and muscles, these physical agitations, but they seemed disconnected from any rational thought or will. The link between the internal state, passion idea, and the external action movement seemed broken. That disconnection was madness, in a sense.
And this view extended to even subtle behaviors.
Yes, absolutely. Classical thought saw a general essence of madness, lurking even in minor alterations of the mind. Foucault talks about implicit delirium, not just wild raving, but also silent gestures, wordless violence, oddities of conduct.
Like what sort of oddities?
Well, he cites James's dictionary, a medical text from the time, which gives these incredibly specific, almost theatrical examples. Someone might be considered delirious if they, say, compulsively tear out tufts of wool from their bedding, or make repetitive motions similar to that which serves to catch flies, or if they suddenly talk too much or too little against his normal habits, or even things like exposing themselves inappropriately. These weren't just quirks. They were seen as visible signs of that underlying breach, that essential madness.
It's fascinating how closely they observed behavior for signs of this inner state. But Foucault makes a really critical distinction here between error and illusion. Why is that so important?
This is absolutely key to understanding how insanity emerges as a specific concept for Foucault. He points out that in classical thought, a dream is illusory. It deceives, it leads to confusions, but crucially, it's not considered erroneous.
What's the difference? Why isn't a dream erroneous?
Because while you're dreaming, you're not actively asserting the dream's reality against evidence. You're just experiencing it. Therefore, Foucault concludes there's nothing insane about dreaming itself, no matter how bizarre the dream content.
Okay, so madness isn't just about having strange perceptions or images like in a dream or a fever.
Exactly. It's not the presence of the bizarre image alone. Madness, for the classical age, truly begins when those images or perceptions receive affirmation or negation that constitutes error. It's when the person believes the illusion, asserts it as reality, holds onto it with conviction, even when all external reality contradicts it.
So it's the belief in the false perception that marks it as madness.
Precisely. The famous Encyclopedia of the Enlightenment put it perfectly. To be mad is to depart from reason with confidence and in the firm conviction that one is following it. The madman deceives himself, stuck in this erroneous consciousness. They don't just see a ghost, they know it's real, they argue for its reality, they act based on its reality. That unwavering, mistaken conviction is the core of insanity in this view.
That distinction makes a lot of sense. It's about the judgment, the conviction, not just the perception. Now, what about specific conditions like melancholia or hysteria? How did they fit into this framework?
Melancholia was understood quite specifically. It was described as a long, persistent delirium without fever, during which the sufferer is obsessed by only one thought. It was often linked, through the old humoral theory, to an excess of black bile.
Right, the old humors.
And its defining characteristics were profound fear and sadness. These weren't just symptoms. They defined the very quality, the coloration, the unique landscape of melancholic delirium, distinguishing it from, say, the frenzy of mania or the confusion of dementia. It was a specific kind of sustained, erroneous consciousness dominated by a single dark theme.
And hysteria. We often think of it as Victorian, but it had a longer history. How did they understand it in the classical age? Did they still think the womb was wandering around?
That's the fascinating part. The older idea of a literal uterine displacement was starting to fade, but the uterus was still seen as the origin point. They rejected the idea of the organ physically moving, but instead theorized about a secret propagation through the pathways of the organism.
Okay, how did that work?
The brain became seen as a kind of relay station, and a key concept was sympathy. Now, this isn't emotional sympathy. It was a medical idea that different organs and parts of the nervous system were interconnected and could influence each other, almost like a chain reaction.
So a problem starting in the uterus could trigger symptoms elsewhere, like in the brain or nerves, through this network of sympathy.
Exactly. That's how they explained how seemingly unrelated symptoms could arise. For instance, they noted that a strong smell or hearing a tragic story could cause fainting spells or convulsions in women considered delicate and highly sensitive. The stimulus was distant, but the bodily system reacted as a whole due to this interconnected sympathy, with the nervous system transmitting the disturbance originating from the uterine region.
So it's moving away from literal anatomy towards a more systemic, almost neurological view, even with this older concept of sympathy.
Yes, it's a step in that direction. It's still physical, rooted in nerves and humors and organ interactions, but it's becoming more abstract, less about literal wandering organs and more about functional connections and nervous pathways.
Interesting. Now, given this understanding of madness, the breached passions, the erroneous beliefs, the sympathetic nerves, what did treatment look like? How did they try to cure madness back then?
The therapeutics were often quite dramatic and paradoxical. They actually used passion itself, particularly fear, as a tool against madness.
Using fear to treat madness, how did that work?
It wasn't psychological in our sense. They weren't trying to talk someone through their fears. The idea was to physically shock the system. They believed fear could, metaphorically, petrify the operations of the nervous system, sort of congealing its two mobile fibers and controlling the disordered movements. It was thought to jolt the body-soul connection back into alignment by attacking that unity through reciprocal symbolism. Basically, a strong physical or emotional shock could break the pattern of erroneous thought.
That sounds pretty intense. And Foucault also talks about doctors using ruses or tricks.
Yes, this is where it gets really theatrical. Physicians often employed elaborate tricks, playing directly into the patient's specific delusion to try and break it.
Can you give an example?
Well, Foucault recounts this classic story of a melancholic man who was absolutely convinced he had no head. The doctor didn't argue. Instead, he got a very heavy lead cap made and placed it firmly on the man's head.
Okay.
The sheer weight and physical discomfort of the heavy cap apparently provided such undeniable sensory proof that he did have a head, that his delusion just vanished.
Wow. Just like that.
According to the story, yes. Another famous one is the man who refused to eat because he believed he was dead. The physician staged a kind of dead men's banquet, bringing in other people, presumably actors, pretending to be dead and enjoying a feast. The patient, seeing other dead people eating, was tempted, joined in, ate the food. And the physical act of eating, the restoration it provided, supposedly broke both the delusion and the underlying physical disturbance.
So these treatments were about manipulating the physical sensation or the immediate situation, not about understanding the root cause psychologically.
Exactly. They were clever, sometimes brutal, manipulations aimed at triggering a spontaneous physical or behavioral reaction that would snap the patient out of their erroneous conviction. Very different from our approaches today.
Definitely. So all this observation, classification, these rather extreme therapies,
Yeah.
where did it ultimately lead in terms of how we think about the mind?
Foucault argues this whole process led to a crucial split. What used to be a broader concept, unreason, which included not just madness but also philosophical questions about existence, folly, the limits of rationality, got separated from madness.
How so?
Madness increasingly became viewed as simply disease, an organic problem, a specific pathology located within the physical body, something to be treated medically. And unreason, that bigger, more philosophical dimension, that got pushed aside, relegated to the emerging field of psychology.
So psychology wasn't born as the answer to madness.
Not according to Foucault. He argues psychology was born precisely because madness had been detached from its truth, which was unreason. Madness became, in his words, a phenomenon adrift, stripped of its deeper philosophical meaning, reduced to an enigma without any truth except that which could reduce it, to a manageable, measurable, potentially curable organic issue.
That's a profound shift. So this whole intricate history shows you, the listener, how our very definitions of illness aren't just based on pure biology.
Not at all. They're deeply shaped by the scientific ideas, the philosophical assumptions, the social needs, even the treatment methods of a particular era. What we call a disorder today has this long, complex lineage behind it, a history intertwined with power, economics, and changing ideas about the body and soul.
Okay, this brings us squarely to the asylum, the physical architecture of control, and how Foucault links power and knowledge. Let's talk about his method again, his archaeology.
Right, his critical history of thought. It's crucial to remember he's not looking for smooth progress. He's digging for those breaks, those disruptions. He wants to understand how certain ways of thinking, certain institutions like the asylum, emerged often, he argues, not through some grand plan, but through a series of accidents, contingencies, and forgotten power struggles.
And power is central here, but not just power held by kings or governments?
No, that's key. Foucault insists that power isn't just located at the top, it's exercised everywhere. It flows through the entire social system, in interactions, in institutions, in rules, in expectations. It's often hard to say exactly who holds it.
But you can easily see who lacks it.
Precisely. And it operates through all sorts of subtle mechanisms: control, surveillance, prohibition, constraint, things that seem minor school timetables, hospital routines, the way office spaces are designed. Power works at this micro level. And the asylum became a kind of laboratory for perfecting these techniques.
So how did the asylum itself function as this mechanism of control? It wasn't just about locking doors, was it? Foucault talks about a shift away from physical chains.
Yes, particularly in places often hailed as more enlightened, like the retreat run by Quakers in England. The obvious physical restraints, the chains, the whips were gradually replaced by something more subtle: self-restraint.
Self-restraint. How does that work if you're confined?
It works by engaging the patient psychologically through structured routines, constant work, and the observation of others, and crucially, the perpetual threat of recognition of guilt. Patients were constantly encouraged, pressured, to monitor themselves, to judge their own thoughts and behaviors against the norm, to internalize the rules. Foucault calls this a shift from a world of censure, where bad behavior was openly punished, to a universe of judgment, where you're constantly evaluating yourself and being evaluated.
Which leads to his idea that in the asylum, madness only exists as seen.
Exactly. It stops being primarily an internal experience for the person and becomes defined by how it looks to the observer, the doctor, the staff. The close proximity in the asylum wasn't for therapy or empathy in our modern sense. It was for observation that watches, that spies, that comes closer in order to see better. But this observation, Foucault argues, actually creates distance, because it only accepts and acknowledges only the values of the stranger, the values of the sane observer imposing their norms.
So the science that developed there was about watching and classifying, not dialogue.
Fundamentally, yes. It became a science of observation and classification, recording symptoms, categorizing behaviors, fitting people into boxes. The mad person becomes an object to be studied, managed, known by the expert, rather than a subject whose own experience or reason is engaged with.
That feels uncomfortably relevant sometimes, even today, the way we can reduce people to labels or symptoms. And Foucault takes this even further, arguing that psychiatry itself is a kind of moral tactic. What on earth does he mean by that?
It's one of his most provocative claims. He says, what we call psychiatric practice is a certain moral tactic, contemporary with the end of the 18th century, preserved in the rites of asylum life, and overlaid by the myths of positivism.
Okay, break that down. A moral tactic hidden by science.
He's suggesting that psychiatry, right from its origins in the asylum, wasn't just a neutral scientific project to cure illness. It was fundamentally about imposing a certain set of moral values, a specific idea of normality and acceptable behavior onto the patients. This moral agenda got masked, overlaid by the language and authority of science, especially positivism, the belief that only observable, measurable facts are real knowledge. The scientific objectivity, he argues, was actually a kind of reification, making this moral judgment seem like a natural, objective fact about the patient's condition.
So underneath the medical procedures and diagnoses, there was a hidden curriculum of enforcing social norms.
That's the core of his argument, a system of moral judgment disguised as objective medicine.
That's a huge challenge to the field. And it connects to his wider point about the human sciences, making the human subject into an object of knowledge, right? How does the madman become governmentalizable?
Right. The very act of studying, classifying, and diagnosing the mad person makes them manageable, makes them governmentalizable, subject to governance and control. And Foucault argues this often happens by viewing them through a specific lens, the lens of Homo economicus.
Homo economicus, the rational economic man. How does that apply to someone deemed mad?
It's about reducing the person, their behavior, their potential, primarily to economic terms. Are they productive? Are they capable of working? Are they a burden on society? This grid of intelligibility, this way of understanding people based on their economic function or dysfunction, allows power to operate. Interventions, whether treatment or confinement or rehabilitation, can then be framed as ways to make the person more productive, less costly, better integrated into the economic order. It's a way of managing populations by managing their economic potential, or lack thereof.
So even care can be framed in terms of economic utility. That's chilling. And what about the unconscious? How does that fit into this picture of the human sciences creating objects of knowledge?
Foucault sees the problem of the unconscious as fundamental to the human sciences. Not just Freud, but the whole project of trying to uncover the hidden depths, the non-conscious motivations, desires, and structures that shape human behavior. This constant drive to unveil the non-conscious makes individuals even more transparent, more legible to systems of knowledge and power, because now even your inner life, your hidden thoughts can be interpreted, categorized, and potentially managed by experts.
And this is where his idea of genealogy comes back in reminding us these truths about our inner lives aren't fixed.
Exactly. Genealogy isn't about finding the one true origin. It's about tracing the messy history, the myriad events, the accidents, the errors, the false appraisals, the power struggles that actually gave birth to the concepts and practices we now take for granted. Truth, for Foucault, isn't some pure essence discovered. It emerges from this exteriority of accidents. It's what stuck, what won out in those historical battles.
So what does this mean for you, the listener, trying to navigate today's world? It's a powerful reminder that systems of knowledge in mental health, education, criminology, even things like marketing or data science are never truly neutral.
They're always intertwined with power. They shape how we see the world, how we see ourselves, and who gets to define what's normal or acceptable.
So Foucault encourages you to be critical. When you encounter classifications, diagnoses, interventions, ask, where did this idea come from? Whose interests does it serve? Who is being made governable here, and why? It's about looking beneath the surface like seemingly objective knowledge.
Okay, so as we approach the modern era, Foucault really shakes up a story many of us learned: the great liberation of the insane. Figures like Penal in France, Tuke in England, they're usually portrayed as heroes who struck off the chains.
Right, the dawn of humane treatment.
But Foucault offers a much more critical view. He suggests this apparent liberation was actually a gigantic moral imprisonment.
Moral imprisonment? How? The chains were gone, weren't they?
The physical chains, yes. But Foucault argues they were replaced by invisible chains, the chains of guilt, self-surveillance, and the constant pressure to conform to the asylum's moral code. The control became internalized, psychological, arguably even more pervasive.
He uses Goya's painting, The Madhouse, to illustrate this, doesn't he?
Yes, it's a fascinating interpretation. He says a painting isn't really about the spectacle of madness itself, but about the vast monotony of these new bodies, shown strong and vigorous, trapped within this new order. Their gestures, he says, celebrate a kind of dark freedom, the freedom only to exist within the prescribed norms of the asylum, constantly observed, judged. It reflects, for Foucault, the world Penal created ordered, controlled, but morally confining.
So a shift from physical force to moral force, but still a form of deep confinement. That's a really challenging perspective on supposed progress. If madness was being contained this way, morally imprisoned, what happened to that wilder unreason Foucault talked about earlier? Did it just vanish?
Not at all. Foucault argues it finds other outlets. It erupts, often powerfully, in art and transgression.
Oh, so?
He contrasts the medicalized, managed madness of the asylum with what he calls the lightning flash of works by figures like the poets Hölderlin and Nerval, the philosopher Nietzsche, the playwright Artaud. Many of these figures struggle profoundly themselves.
Right.
But Foucault insists their work, their expressions of unreason, are forever irreducible to those alienations that can be cured. Their insights, their art, can't just be dismissed as symptoms of a disease. They represent something deeper, something that resists that moral imprisonment, that challenges the very definitions of sanity imposed by the asylum.
And this connects somehow to the Marquis de Sade. That seems like a leap.
It's a startling but crucial connection for Foucault. He argues that right at the end of the 18th century, as confinement becomes the norm, unreason transformed into delirium of the heart, madness of desire, with the emergence of sadism.
How did confinement lead to sadism?
Unreason, Sade's work, reappears as language and desire, not just as visible folly. And crucially, Foucault points out, sadism was born of confinement and within confinement. Sade wrote much of his work while imprisoned for decades. His texts are saturated with images of the fortress, the cell, the cellar, the convent, the inaccessible island, the very architecture of control. So, unreason, suppressed and locked away, bursts out in this new, extreme linguistic form, using the language of its own prison to express a radical transgressive desire.
Wow. So the attempt to silence unreason actually provoked this extreme, articulate, perverse expression of it from within the walls.
That's Foucault's provocative reading. It's unreason finding a new, disturbing voice precisely because it was confined.
And what about the madness of the artist more generally? Is it just illness or something else for Foucault?
He sees it as distinct from simple illness, and also different from, say, Platonic divine inspiration. He describes it as a subterranean relationship. It's a state that connects the artist intensely to their work, but also makes them alien to others. And paradoxically, it can also situate the artist outside their work, blinding them even as they create. This difficult internal position allows them to access a dark interiority, to push language and perception beyond conventional limits.
And this relates to how literature itself changed, became more rebellious.
Yes, in the 19th century especially, Foucault sees literature becoming a contestation of philology, a fight against the rigid grammatical rules and fixed meanings of traditional language study. Literature tried to get back to the naked power of speech, the untamed, imperious being of words.
So less about proper form, more about raw expression.
Exactly. Defying genres, embracing the scandalous, the ugly, the impossible. Literature created its own space to deny classical values like good taste and simple pleasure, exploring darker, more complex, more unsettling aspects of existence that rational discourse couldn't easily handle. It became another site where unreason could speak.
So bringing this all together for today, how do these ideas about unreason, power, and knowledge still play out?
Well, Foucault's central idea that power is exercised everywhere feels incredibly relevant, remembering it's not just top-down commands, but operates through subtle controls, surveillance, norms, constraints, even in seemingly trivial areas. This helps us see how conformity is produced, how people are shaped, often without overt force.
And the homo economicus idea, still relevant.
Absolutely. Think about how often individuals and social problems are framed in economic terms today. Education judged by job market outcomes. Healthcare decisions influenced by cost effectiveness. Social programs designed around incentivizing work. Even our online lives quantified by engagement metrics. This tendency to view people through an economic grid of intelligibility is precisely what Foucault identified as a key way individuals become governmentalizable, managed and regulated according to economic logic.
So this historical journey Foucault takes us on isn't just about the past. It gives you, the listener, tools to understand the present.
Definitely. It helps you see how concepts like madness or unreason aren't just medical facts, but can also be sites of resistance, sources of creativity, ways of challenging norms. It shows how fluid these categories are.
And it encourages you to look critically at contemporary systems, mental health, yes, but also education, economics, technology, and see how those historical patterns of control, observation, and normalization, often tied to economic goals, might still be operating today, perhaps in new forms. Okay, so that was an intense journey through Foucault's madness and civilization. We've traced this incredible arc, haven't we?
We really have. From madness as this visible, almost accepted folly in the Renaissance,
Right, part of the human landscape.
to its silencing and confinement in the classical age, driven as much by economics and the demand for labor as by anything else.
It's then becoming an object of scientific study, classified, medicalized, leading to the birth of psychology, but maybe, as Foucault argues, stripping away some of its deeper meaning.
And finally, seeing how unreason pushes back, finding expression in art, in transgression, like Sade, resisting that confinement, that medical definition.
And the core message from Foucault throughout this deep dive is really to question the naturalness of it all. These shifts weren't inevitable steps towards enlightenment.
Not at all. He shows how our ways of understanding sanity, madness, normality, deviance, they're constructed. They're products of specific historical moments, shaped by knowledge systems that are always tangled up with power.
So, being truly well-informed, as you try to be, isn't just about knowing today's definitions or statistics. It's about understanding that historical context, those power dynamics that created the categories we use.
Because those categories are never neutral. They shape how we see ourselves and how we see others.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to take away and chew on. It comes directly from Foucault's unsettling idea about truth. If truth is undoubtedly the sort of error that cannot be refuted because it was hardened into an unalterable form in the long baking process of history, then what truths about human behavior, about health, success, normality, what firmly held beliefs are we holding on to today, maybe without even realizing it, that might just be those hardened historical errors waiting for their own critical examination?
It's a challenge, isn't it, to look around at our own assumptions?
It really is. We encourage you to think about it. What other concepts, categories, or unquestioned truths in your own life, your work, or society at large might actually be the product of specific historical forces, rather than timeless facts? What might need its own critical unpacking?